Hey, what's up, everybody, and welcome back to That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host, Michael, and this episode is Q&A number 27. As always, any questions that you have that you want answered, send them on michael@scientifictriathlon.com or through the Facebook Messenger widget on scientifictriathlon.com. And I'll add them to the queue and answer them on a future Q&A episode that comes out every Thursday. This episode is sponsored by Roka, that are the world leaders in wetsuits, tri-suits, and other triathlon and swim apparel. They started out as a mission to simply make the world's fastest wetsuit, and it's a young company that has seen a very fast rise to the top in the triathlon market initially, but now also in the, for example, performance eyewear category, which they are also becoming one of the most established and definitely most exciting players in. An example of how quickly Roka has started to dominate and shown how fast their products are is the swim skin count at Kona at the Ironman World Championships, where Roka every year they conduct a swim skin count of all the different brands on the professional athletes. And they have been winning for the last 3 or 4 years, I think it was, when we talked about this with the Roka team. And this is, of course, most of these years it has been Roka's internal count, but one year there was an official swim skin count, and that also had the exact same count as Roka. Of course, it's not that difficult at the end of the day to count different swim skin brands. So Roka has been taking charge of that swim skin market in Kona. And similarly, if you go to Ironman events and you start to count wetsuits, it's amazing how many of those great athletes are using Roka as their go-to wetsuit, because it is such an amazing brand with fantastic and really fast products. You can get 20% off any of their products, including wetsuits, swim skins, tri-suits, but also performance eyewear. Go and check them out. They also now have even prescription glasses. So use the promo code TTS, all caps, to get 20% off on roka.com. And big thanks to Precision Hydration, that make electrolytes that you can tailor to your individual electrolyte needs. Precision Hydration is also trusted by the top professionals in not just triathlon, but in plenty of endurance sports, as well as team sports and a wide variety of individual sports, and even everyday and work environment health. Some triathletes that you've probably heard of and are very familiar with that use Precision Hydration as their go-to for electrolytes are, for example, Ben Canute, Michelle Dillon, Stuart Hayes, and Sarah Lewis, to name just a few. And what you can do to find out how you can benefit from Precision Hydration electrolytes is to take their individual online sweat test. They will give you a very good estimate for how much sodium and electrolytes you lose and how you should replace them in training and racing. And then you can use the promo code THATTRIATHLONSHOW, all one word, all caps, to get your first box of electrolytes for free on precisionhydration.com. And now for the first question of today's episode, I actually bring on Andy Blow from Precision Hydration as an expert guest to answer this question, because it's on cramping, which Andy knows a heck of a lot more about than I do. So I felt that I needed to bring on some expert help to answer this question, which is from Chris in Victoria, British Columbia in Canada. And I'll play a clip with Andy and myself, and we will read the question and then get into answering it. So let's hear that clip right now. So expert guest for this cramping question here is Andy Blow from Precision Hydration. Welcome, Andy. Can you give a short introduction of yourself for listeners that may not have heard you on the podcast before?
Absolutely. My name's Andy Blow. My company, Precision Hydration, kind of partly was founded because of cramping issues that I had, amongst other issues that when I was racing long distance triathlons in the heat. And so although I think, cramping's a complicated question, I have got quite a lot of first-hand experience of it, getting over my problems as an athlete. And now through Precision Hydration, we work with quite a lot of athletes who approach us who do have cramping issues. So we're quite interested in that whole topic.
Yeah, and you have a lot of good articles as well on that. So people that want to learn more than what we'll discuss in this question can go to your website and check that out on the blog, for example, or the newsletter. But this specific question, I guess, is I'm going to summarize it because it's quite long. But this is somebody who has been training for triathlons and endurance sports for the better part of 20 years, training for half Ironmans, mostly right now in June and September, training 6 days per week and 3 runs, 2 bikes, and at least 3 swims per week. So they also write that their long, slow work is truly both long and slow. The problem is here that on Tuesdays and Thursdays they have evening workouts that are quality runs, so hill runs, tempo runs, or sprints, followed by a swim session. And they write that almost inevitably my legs will cramp during the swim, usually in the foot, but occasionally in the hamstring or the quad. And they have tried various strategies to help with this problem. And there are some patterns, but that, for example, if they haven't had enough water during the day or if sleep has been lacking, then the cramping can be worse. They've tried increasing electrolytes and tripling salt intake over the past year. And also, they're taking an easily digestible glycogen source throughout the workout. But the problem persists. And so what can we help with here, Andy? Because I'm lost.
Yeah, it is a tricky one, and I would say first up, when we deal with people who are getting persistent muscle cramps, for a small proportion of them, there are often very easy fixes. You can suggest 1 or 2 things to try, and then they try them, and the problem goes away. For another group of people, it becomes more tricky to unpick it and requires a lot more trial and error of different strategies. And then sadly, there are a group of people that seem to suffer with persistent muscle cramps that are very, very difficult to solve, or sometimes almost impossible to solve. And that the bottom line that for why I think that happens is that despite all the competing arguments about what causes cramping, nobody really knows yet. There's lots of theories and there's lots of overlapping or even conflicting theories, but there's no one kind of universal answer. And so there's definitely not a universal solution to that problem. In order to sort of unpick this one, though, I would say first off, getting cramps swimming, especially following heavier bike or run sessions, is a pretty common problem in triathletes. I don't know if you've come across that, either yourself or with athletes you've worked with.
I've personally experienced that, yes.
Yeah, I certainly have as well. And I used to get, and still do occasionally get, cramps in my feet, especially if I've done a really hard run or a really hard bike session and then jump in the pool, and when you're pushing off or doing kicking and those kind of things. And there seems to be something about that action of going from heavy loading and heavy stress and fatigue in the muscles to then, I don't know what it is about being either weight supported or changing the angles of force and things in the pool, but it definitely seems to be a bit of a recipe for making people cramp. So I don't think his issue is in any way unique. So although the person asking the question has said that they've, for instance, started to manipulate their electrolyte intake and specifically increase their sodium intake, and that would always be a first port of call for us to say, look, sometimes for whatever reason the mechanism is not very well understood and disputed, but it does seem that if electrolytes, especially sodium, get out of balance or become diluted or depleted, then that can affect the way muscles fire and can cause cramping. So what we usually recommend in that scenario is something to try is switching out some either no sodium or low sodium drinks immediately in either before or during the preceding activity, or between the preceding activity and the one that brings the cramping on, is to take a very strong electrolyte drink, a very strong sodium based electrolyte drink, to see if ingesting that either then reduces the frequency or the severity of cramps or makes them go away altogether. So it sounds like this person's tried that to no avail or to limited effect. There are other things which we've had a very interesting recent case with a professional triathlete who often gets cramps in the swim, either swim training or swimming during Ironman races. And it's probably not someone who we should talk about by name, but they are a past world champion over long distance, and so competing at a very high level, but have for years struggled with this sort of very unpredictable cramps that would often happen in the swim portion, either of races or of training sessions. And we did quite a lot of trial and error, when they did quite a lot of trial and error themselves recently, and have started to narrow it down to actually potassium intake rather than sodium intake, which is perhaps unusual, but there is a plausible sort of story around why getting potassium balance wrong might influence muscle cramping, because although sodium is the main electrolyte in your extracellular fluid and the one that you lose most of when you're sweating, and that's the one people focus on, potassium is the main intracellular electrolyte. So if potassium in your extracellular fluid gets higher than its normal baseline level, which can sometimes happen if people take any sports supplements which are quite high in potassium, it can create problems. It can actually, in the extremes, it create electrical problems like cardiac muscle problems and arrhythmias, but also excitability or fatigue in skeletal muscles as well. And therefore, we found with this athlete, and they found through their own trial and error, that actually reducing their day-to-day potassium consumption, and certainly around specific training sessions, massively reduced the incidences of cramping that they were suffering from.
So what were the foods or supplements that they got potassium through that they started to cut out?
Predominantly for this athlete, it was a couple of specific sports supplements that they were using, which didn't have massively high levels of potassium, but because of the fact that they were using a lot of them, because of their high energy and fluid output, they were taking what would be considered a reasonably high amount of potassium in, on days when they were training heavily, which was then what precipitated the cramping. So for them, it was reading the packets of supplements. I think if you're eating, fairly natural whole foods, and I'm not an expert dietitian in that respect, but I think it's relatively hard to ingest really high amounts of potassium through your normal diet. It tends to be more problematic if people are taking supplements with high levels in.
So in this case, since this listener does take in an easily digestible glycogen source, to phrase verbatim, that might be a case to look at the labeling there and see if there's potassium.
Yeah,
or
definitely.
Significant amount of potassium there.
And just looking at the diet in general, maybe taking some advice from a dietitian to look at the diet in general and say, is this either particularly low or particularly high in any electrolytes or potassium specifically? Because I think an imbalance can occur when it gets too low as well as gets too high. So really, I think just a general health check, and probably just a general blood check, some kind of blood profile to look at electrolyte levels in the blood to see if they're running chronically low or high potassium or sodium levels would be an interesting one to look at.
Yeah.
There's a lot of other, when it comes to muscle cramping, there are often sort of there can be kind of mechanical things and neurological things which cause it when you overstress muscles or put them in positions they're not used to, and stress and load them in ways that they're not comfortable. It's kind of a protective mechanism. I'm sure most people have experienced kind of a muscle cramp that occurs when you either, maybe you've got into a particularly in or out of a particularly low seat of a sports car or something like that, where you're very cramped up at the hips and your hip flexor might cramp a little bit, or something where you're trying to climb over a high barrier and you're having to really stretch your hamstrings and your legs, and you might feel a bit of a cramp when you really put the muscle in a funny position. And so with muscle cramps that are caused by those kind of positional or fatigue or sudden fatigue situations, we definitely find that athletes benefit from strength work, stretching, and sports massage to basically make the muscles stronger. One case that we dealt with last year was an athlete who was persistently getting cramping in their hip area, particularly in the sort of groin area, when they rode their race bike in a low position as compared with their training bike, which wasn't quite set up the same. And we eventually narrowed that down to the sort of specificity of the training for those muscle groups, because they were sitting lower on their race bike at the front end, and also pushing obviously harder, because in a race you are often pushing close to your maximum limits, and that was causing them to cramp when training at a slightly lower intensity and training on a slightly lower position wasn't really conditioning the muscles quite specifically enough. So, yeah.
I find when I'm, because I have been getting a lot of cramps in swimming in particular, not so much in the other sports, but and I do find that it's related to intensity.
Yeah.
Like the harder the swim is, the more likely it is that I'll cramp. But the trigger for me, at least, always seems to be the push off.
Yeah.
And so it always happens in the main set, and when I'm trying to basically hit my times by pushing off as well as I possibly can, and if I actually go a bit easier with the push-offs, then I can prevent the cramps usually from occurring in the first place. But usually I'm more concerned with actually hitting the times than preventing cramps, because I don't know that they're going to occur. So then they happen, and I hindsight is 2020. But my theory has been like very just not based on anything other than my wild guesses, is that it's like a rapid rate of force development that you're producing when you're pushing off. It's and that sort of, I guess, neurological or neuromuscular stress, I should say, that happens in a short time, that somehow might be related. You use a lot of motor units in your muscles to produce that force that rapidly. Do you think there's anything to that, and anything that can be gleaned from that sort of theory?
100%. I think for endurance athletes, we're not very well conditioned to recruiting large amounts of muscle fibers for peak force production all at one time, and so pushing off the wall is one of the few occasions when you actually do that. A lot of the time you are, like you say, you're pushing off really hard, you're training, you're going for a time, and that is an occasion when you're going to recruit a really large amount of muscle fibers for a big forceful contraction really quickly. So we don't tend to train for that. So we're taking those muscles outside of that comfort zone. And as you say, simply by moderating that in your head and pushing off a little bit more lightly, you recruit less muscle fibers less aggressively, and then the cramping either doesn't happen or doesn't come back. So there are kind of behavioral things that you can do. The same as if we talk about muscle cramp occurring when running or cycling, we all know that quite often simply backing off the pace a little bit, either for the rest of the session or the rest of the duration of what you're doing, or for a short time period, allows the muscles to recover a little bit, and then the cramping can sometimes just go away. So I think muscle recruitment and overstretching the level of muscle recruitment that you're conditioned to regularly dealing with is definitely a precipitating factor. Whether it kind of is the root cause of the cramp, or whether it's just the stimulus that ends up making it manifest there and then is not clear, but it's a contributory factor.
I want to read the last part of the question here as well. So this question ends with, is there something I can do about this? Is this just my muscles telling me they are done for the day and I should just pack it in? Is there any situation when that is the case, when you should just pack it in? And can you elaborate on that?
I think that the answer is it could be, not always, and I think reading between the lines on this particular case, it sounds like it's happening so frequently that unless this athlete is very, very bad at reading other signs of fatigue and tiredness, then it's unlikely, if it's happening with this level of frequency, that it would just be down to that, and that they should just kind of give in and say, well, if that's going to happen, I should just stop. I think that this would be one of those situations where I'd be more inclined to go a bit further around the houses to try more things in order to go for it. If, on the other hand, it doesn't happen frequently to you, and along with general feelings of fatigue and tiredness and anything else, you end up starting to cramp pretty badly in a session, it's definitely a pretty strong signal from the body that something's not right, and that therefore you are probably advised to take note of it. So if it's happening regularly and you're kind of conditioned to the level of training that you're doing, but it's still interrupting sessions, then I would be more persistent about investigating the root cause of it. On the odd occasion, if you are particularly fatigued when it happens, maybe it is just another sign to back off that day, is how I would probably approach that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The other thing I think to say here, Michael, is we've definitely come across athletes who, if they're getting persistent cramping problems, it can be quite psychologically and quite psychologically debilitating, because they want to try everything they can to solve it. So they will try manipulating their electrolyte intake. They will try stretching and doing strength training and altering the nature of their training sessions, or the way they structure their training sessions. So, for instance, for this guy, maybe you could try, if it's feasible, maybe you would try swimming instead of running rather than the other way around, and see if that helps. But one thing that we commonly see with athletes is that they'll try multiple interventions at a single time. So we often get athletes who say, I've tried taking extra electrolytes and it hasn't worked. And when we drill down into what did you actually do, maybe they've tried using a sort of standard sports drink once or twice and it hasn't had a noticeable effect. So they've kind of binned that methodology, or they've tried doing something while they were doing they've tried sports massage and stretching at the same time as they were trying strength training for the first time, and they try multiple interventions on top of each other, which then makes it very hard from a scientific point of view to actually evaluate and say, right, what is the impact or lack of impact that any single one of these things that I'm doing is. So I think if people are having cramping problems and they want to try things like electrolyte intake, they want to try stretching and strength training, and they want to try sports massage or any of the other interventions that could work, it's good to try those interventions in isolation while you're controlling for all the other variables that might influence it. So in other words, your training load has to be similar to what it normally is when you're experiencing these problems. You don't try multiple interventions at one time, because you want to isolate, right, is this one impactful or not? Evaluate it for a period of time, make sure you're doing it properly, and then evaluate it on its own merits, rather than either trying things very quickly and dismissing them, or trying numerous things together and not being able to unpick whether they're working with each other, against each other, which one's most impactful or not.
Yeah, and making sure that the intervention is done right. So, for example, in terms of electrolytes, people can go and take your free sweat test on the website to actually see how much sweat. But I guess in between workouts, it makes sense to take a strong electrolyte supplement for most about anybody. But in terms of the other interventions, for example, something that came to mind was, if you want to try stretching, then a book that I would recommend, or two books actually, are Jay Dishari's books.
Yeah.
Anatomy for Runners and Running Rewired. They have some really good self-assessments that people can do to find different limiters in terms of flexibility, mobility that might help. So you might find actually that if that something like that might be a big limiter, and perhaps that can be something that with stretching potentially could cause an improvement.
Absolutely, and I think treating, if there's often, I've said in a few people, there is a quick fix for cramping, and sometimes there is. Sometimes it can be as simple as your electrolyte intake is inadequate or out of balance, and by manipulating that, the cramps go away, and that's great. But I think if you approach the issue of cramping with the expectation or even the hope that there will be a quick fix, you can be disappointed, and it's better to approach it like you would lots of other sort of more difficult and complex problems, with the idea that you're going to have to go on a bit of a journey, and you're going to have to be persistent and organized in the way that you tackle it in order to actually bottom it out and get some progress and get a good result. Because athletes are often very determined and focused people in certain ways, but like every other human on the planet, we also love the idea of a quick fix or a quick solution. And I think with cramping, what we've learned is you have to be inventive, persistent, organised, and thorough in the way that you investigate, trying to get over it. Otherwise, you'll be easily defeated.
That sounds a lot like endurance training to me.
It is. I think it's all the same principles, just refocused into tackling a specific problem. But sometimes people say, I hear a lot of the time, oh, if I would be so good in the Ironman if only I didn't get cramps on the run or something. But as if it's something that should just be able to be solved at the click of a finger. And I often say to them, not harshly, but I say, well, I would be really good at the Ironman if I could run 2:35 at the end of the run, but it's not that easy to do that. You've got to work at it, and and so if cramping is one of your particular crosses to bear or problems to solve, then attack it with an open, long-term problem-solving mindset, and you've got a much bigger chance of success.
All right, perfect. I think that wraps it up for this question. But since we have you on, is there anything new with precision hydration that you want to share and that the listeners might be interested in learning about?
We've definitely made some big strides. In the last, well, it's probably a couple of years since we've been initially introduced to you on the show, and I guess one of the major ones is that we've got a new blog on our website, precisionhydration.com. It's got a lot of our old content on there, and it's under the title blog now at the top. It's searchable, keyword searchable. So there's a lot of good hydration and other performance information on there. And in respect to this conversation, we've got a very popular blog on there all about potential causes of cramp, potential solutions. If you go to the blog, it's one of the highlighted ones normally because it's popular, but if you search for cramping on there, then it will pull that up. And what we'd love people to do as well is go visit the blog and search for the performance related advice, not just specifically in the hydration space, because we're building a good resource bank up there that's completely free to access and hopefully will be of use to the endurance athletic community out there.
Perfect. Thank you so much for being the expert guest here, and it was great to get your views on this question.
No, always great to chat to you, Mikhail. Thanks for having us on.
All right, hope that you learned a lot, and Chris, I hope that answered your question, and good luck with solving those cramping issues. We have time for one more short question, and this one is from Brent, who writes, "Hi Michael, I'm trying to qualify for Kona. I'm a 60-year-old male. I've done 20 Ironmans and 2 Konas. I'm wondering, is there a certain CTL number for my age to aim to reach to qualify for Kona? And if so, how do I reach that number?" To clarify for listeners that are not familiar with CTL, that stands for chronic training load, and it's a metric that is used in Training Peaks and other software as well, but most Training Peaks is, I guess, the leader here. That comes from training stress score, which is another related concept there. And if you can just accumulate training stress score, the more you can have, the bigger the rolling average of training stress score simply that you can have on a 6-week basis. So your 6-week rolling average of training stress score, that is your chronic training load. So it basically tells you what your training load has been like over that 6-week 42-day period, and that's an indication of your fitness. The concept is valid, but to answer the question, Brent, whether there is a certain number for your age to reach to qualify and how to reach the number, nope, there isn't any single CTL number that you should try to reach, or that will guarantee you qualifying or not qualifying or anything like that. It is completely I don't want to say irrelevant, but it's completely individual. So you can't apply CTL on a population basis and correlate that with performances. It just doesn't work like that. We have athletes that are very slow that can have CTLs of 100 plus, and we can have athletes that are very fast that never train. So their CTL might be 0 to 30 or something like that, something very low. So to give an example, For example, Jan Frodeno would beat 95% of us or more, even if his CTL was, let's say, 0 to probably even at 0, but at least if he could do a little bit of training and get it to, let's say, 10 or 15 or something like that, he would surely beat 95% or more of all of us as listeners. Even if all of us we didn't have to do any work, we could just train as professionals and we could get our CTL up to 100 plus. But that wouldn't be enough. So that's an example of an extreme example, but an example still that shows you that CTL, it tells you very, very little about performance. It can tell you something about your individual performance. For example, if you qualified previously and you had a CTL of, let's say, 90 when you qualified, then you can probably guess that, again, this is a very big simplification, but let's say that you were in the same age group then, theoretically, as you are now, which I know you aren't because you're 60, so you're, I guess, moving up age groups. But to make the example more easy, let's say you qualified last year and you had a CTL of 90, then you know that your fitness was good enough at a CTL of 90 that it allowed you to have a performance to qualify. So that can tell you that if you get to that same fitness level and you can translate that into the same sort of performance level, you could have a pretty good chance of qualifying. On the other hand, if 2 years prior your CTL was, let's say, 70 and you had a performance that was significantly worse and that caused you not to qualify, then you know that, well, maybe I just didn't train enough because I didn't have a high enough CTL. But again, this is super individual, so you cannot really draw any population level conclusions on that. But even for you as an individual, I would definitely encourage you not to put too much stock in CTL. See it just as one small tool in your toolbox of things that you take as inputs, I guess, for structuring your training, but just one of many tools and definitely not anywhere near the most important one. You could have, even as an individual, not comparing you to anybody else, but comparing you to yourself, you might have a CTL of 120 1 year and perform way worse in races than you did at CTL of 80 for a number of reasons. And these might be that you just had poor training structure. Maybe you didn't structure your training at all. You just went out and rode your bike and ran and swam, or it might be insufficient recovery, or it might be just too much focus on inputs in terms of training stress that you put in and put on your body compared to focusing on the actual outputs that you want to have out of training, the all important training adaptations, which is something that I think a lot of age groupers, self-coach age groupers, forget most of the time. That not most of the time. Sorry, that wasn't what I meant to say. But sometimes that what we're actually after is training adaptations. We're not after the input of training. We're after the output of training. And of course, it can require a lot of input to get a good or a lot of output. There is definitely a correlation there. But if you only focus on the input or get too single-minded in trying to increase the input and forget about trying to optimize the output, then you're really missing the big picture there. So do not chase a CTL number. Look up articles on coachcox.co.uk instead to find what times you would typically need to do in any given race to qualify for Kona in any given age group. And Coach Cox, he was a guest in episode 76, I want to say, so I'll link to that as well, because that was a really good one about qualifying for Kona. He really pulls together statistics from all the Ironman races and what times are needed to qualify. Amazing resource if you're looking to qualify for Kona. So go and check that out and look for a time. And that is the performance that you need to have. It's the output, not the input in your goal race, and work to get the training adaptations that it takes for you to get to that sort of performance level. That is the way that you should be thinking. And the training that you should be doing should be focused on, it will be whatever maximizes your adaptations to the training input and therefore leads to that improved performance, rather than training that just focuses on reaching a certain input, a certain training stress, regardless of how that is achieved, which is one of the most common mistakes and problems I see with using TSS and CTL, that again, people just focus on maximizing that input without thinking about the output, the training adaptations. So that's, I guess, answers your question. But I know that I'm rambling a little bit, but I'll go on a little bit of a rant here about TSS, training stress score, and those TSS-based metrics like CTL. But please remember, everybody, they are somewhat arbitrary, and there is some research as well to suggest that session RPE, for example, might be just as good at measuring training load as TSS-based metrics. So I'm definitely not a hater. I think that they are good tools to use, although I do find that, they become less and less valuable the more that you get to know the athletes that you coach, and the more that you get to know yourself as an athlete if you are self-coached, I think as well. There are definitely scenarios in which I use them and I think that they may be useful, but the problem is, and this is the big issue here, that if you use them, you need to do it with great care and responsibility to not put too big of an emphasis on them and over-reliance on them. And based on all the questions I get about TSS and the TSS-based metrics, a lot of people are not really putting that great care and responsibility in their use of these metrics, but really just getting too narrowly focused on hitting certain numbers and not really thinking about what they're doing enough. There is, I guess, a big over-reliance on these types of metrics, and it causes issues, with poorly structured training being one of them. And the biggest problem is that people stop thinking, I think, with how to structure training. So just putting the blinders on and thinking that, well, if one type of workout gives me 100 TSS and this other workout gives me 100 TSS, it's all the same which one I do. I get the same amount of TSS anyway, so that's going to be it's going to be the same sort of adaptation to training. But no, that's absolutely not the case. Those two workouts, if they are very different, they might give very different responses to the training that you do. So focusing too much on TSS, it leads to that sort of thinking that one workout is equal to another, which may be very, very far from the truth. So probably based on this, I will make some sort of TSS and TSS-based metrics rebuttal episode in the future. Again, I want to say that I'm not a hater. This is not a criticism of the concept, and definitely not of the people that invented the concept, but it's a criticism of the way that it is used today by a lot of athletes. And this is, I guess, just a result of a lack of clear information on the great limiters of the metrics, which the inventors are very well aware of, and most coaches, I hope, are very well aware of, and not using it as any more than one tool in a big toolbox of things to use in training structure. But for self-coached athletes, it seems that this tool sometimes becomes way too dominant, and that's something that I wanted to address here because it aligns nicely with this question from Brent. So that wraps it up for today. Keep sending in those questions. I really enjoy reading through them. I'll link in the episode description to the Precision Hydration blog that we talked about with Andy and Andy's previous appearances on the podcast, which are episodes 49 and 126. Episode 49 was called Hydration, Sodium and Cramping, and episode 126 was Effective Swim Run Training. And I'll also link to the episode with Coach Cox on Kona qualification. One more thing, by the way, I talked with Andy after off air about how things are going, and he mentioned that Precision Hydration are looking for a digital marketing person. So if you are somebody that consider working in the endurance industry and you're a good digital marketing person, then I guess just get in touch with Precision Hydration. You can probably find contact details on their website, or you can contact me and I'll put you in touch with Andy. Yeah, but I just wanted to mention this briefly. So if you think that you might have something to contribute with, and you would consider it exciting to work in the endurance sports industry for a great company like Precision Hydration. Again, I really, really admire what they do, and I'm a big follower of all their work. So I imagine it would be a great place to work if you're. So if you think that you're a good fit, then get in touch and ask them for more details, because I don't know any more details. So yeah, just get in touch directly with Precision Hydration. I think is the best thing to do. So big thanks once again to, first of all, Andy for coming on the podcast and helping contribute as an expert guest, and to Precision Hydration for being a sponsor of the podcast. You can find them on precisionhydration.com. Take their free online sweat test to get an individual hydration strategy, and use the promo code ThatTriathlonShow, all one word, all caps, to get your first box for free. And big thanks to Roka, that you can find on roka.com. That's where you can find all their range of wetsuits, tri-suits, swim skins, goggles, and high-performance eyewear. And you can get 20% off your entire order with the code TTS. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.